second study session for the Communist Manifesto. We'll try to cover chapter 2. We'll see how long it takes us. If you haven't read the text beforehand, that's okay, but for next time it would be better if you read it beforehand. The first question that I thought we would discuss is, according to Marx and Engels, how does the Communist Party have a leading role?
I mean, I can give a Leninist answer.
Go ahead.
They are the vanguard of the proletariat. They are made up of the most well-educated and most well-informed members of the proletariat.
So they're supposed to guide the
they guide the proletariat towards a communist future.
They educate the workers.
Yes.
They try to organize them. They seek to develop their understanding of the world.
From what I've read about it, basically the proletariat isn't divided by nations, and they aren't separated by like minor things, unlike other parties, and their only real interests aligned with the proletariat, and their goal is to overthrow the bourgeoisie. So that's why they are the leading role.
The communists are people who basically they have a theoretical understanding. They're class conscious because they have the theoretical understanding. They understand how capitalism works and how society runs, unlike just the random worker. Of course, a worker can be a communist, and a worker can have a theoretical understanding and can have class consciousness, but that's not necessarily the case. That's why you have workers who are just workers and don't have class consciousness and are not organized, and then you have politically conscious workers who become communists. This is where Lenin gets his idea of vanguardism from. Just because you're a worker doesn't mean that you're automatically class conscious. You could have any number of different worldviews. You might think that your main enemy is people of different countries, or people of different religions, or people of different identities, whatever it may be. You might think like you're a worker and you're a Republican, and your biggest enemies are like anybody who's a liberal or a Democrat or something. But a communist would understand that, of course, it's the capitalists. Basically, the only difference between your average worker and a communist is just the class consciousness and whether they have a scientific socialist theory.
So I'm still a bit confused about the scientific idealist split.
Scientific and idealist. Well, materialism is the outlook of science, basically. The idea that there's an objective outside world, and the outside world is the way it is, regardless of how we feel about it. So materialism believes in an objective world. It's not a subjective world. There's subjective idealism, which basically thinks that the world is or the beauty is kinda in the eye of the beholder. The world is the way you see it or something. And then idealism, of course, believes in the supernatural. So that's why there's a difference between materialism, which is the outlook of science, versus either like subjectivism or like the belief in the supernatural, if that makes sense. Of course, you can still be religious and be a scientist or something, but it's just that the outlook of science or the methodology of science doesn't really work with the supernatural claims.
Another thing is, can like a factory owner be a communist? Because my teacher is always like complaining that Engels was wealthy, and just because he's wealthy, he can't be a communist.
So Engels was the son of a factory owner. So obviously, you can think whatever you want. Like, you can be rich and still have communist opinions, and you can be poor and have very anti-communist opinions. You can really have whatever opinions you want. It's just that, of course, poor people, if they are class conscious, then they're going to be socialists. But if rich people are class conscious, they're going to be capitalists. So I think it was in chapter 1 where Marx and Engels say that there's still some bourgeois who realize that they should support the proletarians because the proletariat is the advanced class. So there's always going to be some people who go against their own class interest. So you can be rich and still support the poor. It's very rare, obviously.
'Cause that's kind of a thing I see used against communists here in American education. Because like the American education will point out that a lot of communists are like lower middle class, and they'll always say like, "Oh, they were enjoying their wealth while the people were suffering," and it just gets kind of annoying.
Well, I mean, they would probably say that if you're a communist, they're going to say, well, oh, it's just because you're a middle class student or whatever, so they'll try to discount you. But then if you're poor, they would just say, well, oh, you're just a poor person, so you don't understand. Like, they'll just say whatever.
You can hold like mutually exclusive positions. Like there's tons of poor people that support the way the system is right now.
And I mean, you'll hear like these, I wouldn't exactly say reactionaries, but conservatives who basically say that Marx knew nothing about the working class. Because they'll always say because he's wealthy, he doesn't understand a thing about work.
He lived in pretty bad poverty at the near the end portion of his life because he was in political exile, had to go from country to country. But Engels, his first book, which I believe he wrote before he was a socialist, it's called The Condition of the Working Class in Britain. He conducted pretty extensive research into how the people worked and how they lived. So I mean, obviously he would know. Like the whole book is just describing like how miserable the conditions for the people are.
What's a dishonest argument? Like they oppose on one side that like if he was really bored that he was just jealous, and on the other side they oppose well he didn't understand what was actually going on because he was rich.
Yeah, it's an irrelevant ad hominem argument. Like instead of dealing with the argument, they just say like, oh well, Marx wasn't himself a coal miner or something, as if they would take if he was a coal miner, they would say well he wasn't a scientist, he doesn't know anything. Well, since he's a scientist now, they say the opposite. So I guess to sum up, the Communist Party consists of the people, the workers who are most theoretically advanced, class conscious. They understand that it's not really about workers of one country versus workers of another country, but it's really just workers against capitalists. And then it says, quote, the communists therefore are, on the one hand, practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. So he's kind of like stressing the international character of this. He's saying that the communists understand that this is not a battle of one country versus another country, and this is not just something that happens in one country and not in other countries. In different countries, the struggle can look different, and different countries are on different levels. In one country, you might have a burning political issue that's one thing, and then in some other country, you have another burning political issue, but that's kind of irrelevant. The communists understand that this is not a country-specific thing. They are not just trade unionists or just worker activists. They are people who have like a scientific socialist theory. They try to provide leadership to the rest of the proletarian movement, and they have as it says, the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march conditions and the general results of the proletarian movement. So I guess a good example of why this is important is if you look at like this is an example that I've used before, the Occupy Wall Street protests, big spontaneous protest movement, and it kind of always had this chronic problem of having no program and no clear aims or clear leadership. So you can have the proletariat and the poor people in general, you can just have them sort of spontaneously protest, but if they don't really have a clear idea of how society works, if they don't understand how capitalism works, and they don't have a historical perspective, they can't look at like the past popular movements and past proletarian movements and have a clear understanding and program and goals, then it's not really going to be effective. The people have always spontaneously protested, but you need more than that. You need to actually have clear goals and leadership, and this is where Lenin's vanguardism also comes from. It's taken from this idea. According to Marx and Engels, in 1848, which is when this was written, what are the tasks of the Communist Party?
Well, it would be like educating and organizing the masses, surely.
Basically trying to make sure that spontaneous revolts have leadership so they don't collapse.
Correct, yeah.
Isn't it also like disproving the idealist philosophers that were, revolutionaries who were at the time that didn't have like a materialist basis?
Yeah, sure. There's going to be a whole chapter later criticizing the utopian socialists and various people like that. Besides the obvious, like educating the workers and trying to provide leadership and all this, the goal at the time was to help the proletariat develop into an independent political force. So basically at the time, they had all these revolutions, these bourgeois revolutions against feudalism and against monarchy, where both the capitalists and the proletarians and the petty bourgeois, they were all allied together against the monarchy. Of course, you still had some capitalists who allied and other people who allied with the feudal aristocracy and the monarchy, but basically the proletariat was working with the capitalists against the feudal aristocracy and monarchy and doing these bourgeois revolutions, like the revolution going on right at that time, the German Revolution of 1848, the Great French Revolution, and all this. And in the French Revolution, it was clearly led by the bourgeoisie, even though the workers also participated in it. But here, Marx is saying that the workers, they can't just be like these pawns of the bourgeoisie, but they have to become an independent political force. They have to start forming their own parties, putting forward their own program, and also having their own theory and their own ideology. They can't just accept the leadership of the bourgeoisie, and they can't just accept the worldview of the bourgeoisie, even though the bourgeois worldview and the bourgeoisie was progressive against feudalism, but the proletariat has to move beyond that, and it's now developed enough where it can become its own class and its own thing, its own power.
So it's like every revolution before then was just bourgeoisie revolutions?
Yeah, and he's saying that even in these bourgeois revolutions, the workers still need to have their own program and be independent.
Any revolution that is started by the bourgeoisie can go well for the workers if they organize into a political faction.
The bourgeoisie is such a small amount of people that even the bourgeois revolution still have to involve people who are not bourgeois. Bourgeois revolution is just a revolution that overthrows feudalism and brings capitalism instead. But even those revolutions are mainly done by workers and peasants, because the bourgeoisie is such a small amount of people. The idea is just that the workers are now strong enough that it doesn't make sense for them to just be following the bourgeoisie all the time. This actually became a topic of debate in the Russian Revolution, because the Mensheviks were claiming that, like in the French Revolution, the proletarians should just follow the bourgeoisie and support the bourgeoisie against the Tsar.
Were Martov and his Mensheviks, were they bourgeoisie, or did they just want a Marxist revolution in a different way?
They didn't want a Marxist revolution at all. They thought that Russia wasn't ready for a Marxist revolution. They thought that Russia was only ready for capitalism, and even in the capitalist revolution, the workers should just support the bourgeoisie. They just wanted to have capitalism. They wanted to go from feudalism to capitalism. This is kind of going off topic, but I guess it's a useful example. Basically, Lenin said that the Russian bourgeoisie is very weak and very reactionary, so it tends to just ally with the Tsar. But the proletariat is very strong and very advanced, so if anybody is going to carry out the bourgeois democratic revolution, then it's going to be the proletariat. Whereas in the French Revolution, the proletariat was still very undeveloped, but the capitalist class was strong. So it was naturally led by the capitalist class. Why do Marx and Engels say that communists are not sectarian, that is, don't put forward any interests different from other workers' parties? And this is kind of an interesting point, because this is not the case anymore. These days, communists definitely do put forward programs that are different from other workers' parties. Why did they say that communists are not sectarian and don't put forward any other interests?
I would think it's because back then the left was most likely more united.
I would say that that's probably true, at least part of it. They basically say that the only difference between communists and other workers is just that communists have a theoretical understanding, and whereas other workers are more just doing spontaneous or more like short-sighted working class struggle. They might just want higher wages, or probably like one of two things. They want economic demands, so higher wages, better conditions, shorter working days, or political demands like overthrowing the monarchy. They might not have an actual, communist analysis, Marxist analysis.
So it's like the left at that time was mostly presenting like small solutions like they are today, but the communists had an actual understanding.
Basically, yes. Chapter 3 talks about other kinds of socialists, and then Chapter 4 talks about other revolutionary parties and other opposition parties to the current establishment. But at that time, the proletariat was still just trying to emerge as a political power, so everybody still had like very similar demands. It was economic demands for better working conditions, better wages. It was political demands to overthrow the monarchy and overthrow the feudal system, and those were like the main demands that were similar with the communists and also the other workers' parties. Obviously, much later there became this whole split where nowadays you have lots of parties that claim to be workers' parties that have completely different ideas from socialism and don't even want socialism anymore.
How would the revolution happen in Finland?
It's hard to say exactly how the revolution would happen, but you can have revolutions that range between not violent or violent. I wouldn't expect there to be like full-on civil war or something. If I had to guess, I would say it's probably a combination of things. Some people getting elected together with a big mass movement, maybe general strike. Probably not like full-on armed uprising unless the capitalists themselves try to use like armed force to like suppress the people, which is what often happens.
I've got another question. I mean, I'm very, 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 very far left, but I always find it hard to go to the authoritarian left. Like I never felt like I always needed help to support the dictatorship of the proletariat, like as in the idea of dictatorship. Like I've never fully understood it in the sense.
Well, the dictatorship of the proletariat only means a society where the workers have power instead of the capitalists having power. The current state is an instrument of the capitalist class, and they need a state in order to keep people in line. So when the workers take power, they will also need a state, a police force, a military, and all that stuff in order to protect themselves so that the capitalists don't just take power back from them.
What about the one-party state?
In socialism, you can have, it doesn't really matter how many parties you have. You can have one party, you can have 10 parties. In the Soviet Union, they only had one party because in the Civil War and after the Civil War, all the opposing parties tried to overthrow the government, so they were all banned. But in some other countries, like East Germany, for example, they had many parties, but I don't really have an opinion on that. So this is a simple question. What is the core idea of communism? If you had to explain communism in as simple a way as possible, how would you explain it?
A stateless, moneyless, and classless society.
That's true, but even more simplified than that. What do communists want?
To be equal. Just to be human, to be honest.
I'm not sure.
To establish social ownership of the means of production with the long-term goal of abolishing class.
The abolition of private property.
Cole's got it right. It's a lot of you said exactly the correct thing, but the manifesto says the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence abolition of private property. On that topic, what is the difference between common property, private property, and personal property?
Isn't personal property like if you like own a bed? That's personal property.
Personal property is property you yourself personally use. Private property.
Yeah, I know. If you like own a bed, like where you sleep in, that's
Yeah,
personal property.
your bed, your clothes.
Is a house personal property?
It depends on whether or not that house is being used as your housing or is it being like rented out. If it's being like rented out, then it's being used as private property.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think abstractly it's best put that personal property is the person who has the personal property acquires a utility out of it, but the capitalist, he's not interested in the what his business produces, but in the money commodity. So when you rent it out, you're not interested in the house per se, you're interested in the rent it can accrue.
You could think of it like public roads, private roads, and then like your driveway. Like the driveway you have is there for you to, park your car on. It's there for your personal use. But then like the public roads are just for the public's use, and then the private road is somebody privately owns that road so that people will use it so that they can get money out of it. They want other people to use it, but they don't necessarily use it themselves.
Right. So private property is like capital investments. Like if you own a company, you own farmland, you have some kind of investment. It's factories, any kind of thing that you own it privately to make money. Whereas personal property is like things you only use for your own, you could say personal consumption. So you have a hamburger, you eat it. You have a toothbrush, you brush your teeth. You have a TV, you watch it. You have a bed, you sleep in it. You have a house, you live in it. Those are your personal property. Common property is similar to private property, except it's not private. So it's used for production, but it's used in or owned in common, collectively. This is an important distinction because when somebody says that they want to abolish private property, then you always have the counter argument. Well, I like my Nintendo and I like my own couch and I like my guitar. Do I really have to collectivize my guitar? Like, no, because that's not what we're talking about. That's personal property. It's not private property. If you owned a guitar factory, then that would be owned in common, but not your personal belongings.
If internet is publicly owned, how much bandwidth will each one of us get?
However much we decide. Let's say we all owned the internet collectively together, then we could also democratically decide how much resources we want to put into the internet. So we've established that the core idea of communism is the abolition of private property. We've established what private property is. It's the workplaces and things that you use for production and to transport the goods and distribute them. So why is abolition of private property beneficial but not harmful to the proletariat? If somebody wants to abolish private property, you always have people making arguments why that shouldn't be done. Well, why are they wrong? Why is it actually only beneficial?
Well, the main problem is that basically the capitalists extract surplus value, which means that the workers must always produce more to get back the same thing they produced. And so you have this anarchic boom-bust cycle in the economy, which just basically just undermines the efficiency of the whole economy.
If I said that I'm gonna nationalize all the factories, and you said no, you shouldn't nationalize the factories, well, I would ask, well, how many factories do you own? You would probably say 0. The argument that the Manifesto makes is that the workers shouldn't care if the factories are nationalized and if the land is nationalized and all that, because the workers already don't own any factories and they already don't own any land. They already don't have any of these things, so they're not losing anything if these are taken into public property. Quite the contrary, now for the first time the workers actually gain these things. Under capitalism, it's only a small group of owners who own all the workplaces and the workers don't own them. But in socialism, everybody owns them together, so the workers actually gain ownership of these things as opposed to losing it. This is another common counter-argument. that abolition of private property leads to universal laziness. Why does abolition of private property not lead to universal laziness?
Because we still need to eat. Like we still need subsistence, and people are going to work in order to subsist, just like in capitalism without exploitation.
It actually leads to the opposite. Like you have a lazy class of people, of private property owners, that don't actually contribute to the economy. If you get rid of these people, and you put the workers in charge of things, yes, they're driven by the same motives as before. They still need to produce things because people still need to consume things. But also that consumption isn't hindered by another group of people just parasitically living off other people's labor.
Yeah, exactly. The manifesto pretty much says exactly that. It says, it has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease and universal laziness will overtake us. According to this, bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness. For those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. The whole of this objection is but another expression of the tautology that there can no longer be any wage labor when there is no longer any capital, which of course is true. So basically, in capitalism, the people who own everything don't work, and the people who work don't own anything. Obviously, that's a bit of an exaggeration. You still have some people who own stuff can work, and there are some small owners who work and stuff like that. But by and large, the working class don't own any of the workplaces. They don't own any of the factories or farmland or railroads or whatever. Whereas the corporate owners don't actually work in the factories. And if they work at all, they might be like doing some kind of management job, but that's not necessary. You can quite well be a capitalist and not work. All it takes is that you own stuff. If workers owning the means of production actually led to universal laziness, then the Soviets would never have sent the first satellite into space.
To add on, Lenin himself said that he who does not work shall not eat. But it's not a dig at disabled or the elderly. It's mainly directed towards the capitalists as well.
Yeah, work was seen as a universal right and a universal responsibility. Everybody should be a productive member of society who contributes and also gets access to all the necessities that they need. That's really how a healthy society should work. Not like capitalism, where some people don't even work and they still, live in complete luxury, and some people work insanely long hours, and other people are forced into unemployment. This is something different. So, what is bourgeois marriage, and why do communists want to abolish it?
Personally, I've never been opposed to marriage if two people want it. I mean, I feel like it doesn't have the same. It's not the same as it used to be. It's somewhat improved. It's no longer about ownership. Am I making any sense?
Yeah, but there's a difference between contemporary marriage and 19th century bourgeois marriage, which was based on property ownership and how private property was given. Well, they were wedded into property to further privatization.
Oh, I never understood this part. What does Marx and Engels mean by community of women?
Marx started writing this book about this topic and about ancient societies, which he'd never finished, but Engels finished it. It was published under the title of Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. Engels actually expands on this topic a lot in that book. When they talk about bourgeois marriage, they mean that in capitalism, women are reliant on men. The man is seen as the breadwinner. The women, they're not independent. They're not self-reliant. They have to get married to a man. Basically, first they live with their family that supports them, and then they get married to some man, and then the man supports them financially. Communists, they basically argue that women should work just like men. They should have equal opportunity to study, get an education, get a job, and that would make them actually be able to provide for themselves. When the capitalists saw this, they said, oh, well, the communists just want to destroy marriage and they want to own women in common. So then Marx and Engels were kind of just making fun of that, like, well, yeah, of course, you would think that because it's really you guys who own your women. But communists don't advocate for that. They advocate that as work becomes collective, the women also be able to join in social labor. This involves things like public education. So children are able to go to public schools. They're not just homeschooled by the women. There's public kindergartens. You don't just have to spend all your time at home taking care and educating your children, and other kinds of programs like that, which try to basically lessen the labor that the women have to do, because especially in older times, women were forced to like do all the household work, which was basically this unpaid labor that they carried out for the men. In socialism, more and more of that household work should be collectively done or socially done, I guess. I don't know what the best term for it would be.
Yeah, like the women produce the used values to the worker. Because, like, for example, like bakers in the 19th century, before the 12-hour Act, would work, I think, for 16 hours or so. And so when is the time for him to eat? And so the wife would produce the subsistence goods for the worker so the capitalists can exploit the worker more. But that's a good question. We don't have so marriage distributes household work more equally. So yet that's a question, is we don't have that anymore.
But we do still have the aspect of people marrying people for wealth and financial gain. Like you can see that with the men and women who will deliberately go out their way to find a partner who will provide them with money. Yeah, you can find it in the sugar the sugar baby industry as well, where people will pretend to be people's girlfriends just for the financial gain, to usually pay off like university debts.
In capitalism, marriage is property arrangement, or it's an economic contract, but it shouldn't really be like that. All right, let's move on. So why does the manifesto say that workers have no country? What does it mean by that?
It means that we need to work cooperatively worldwide on a global scale. It's internationalism.
And that the political systems don't actually represent the workers. Like the governments in those countries don't represent the workers' interests.
Well, people are ultimately more divided by class and anything else. Like if you go to India, you'll still find millionaires and people that are homeless. If you go to Uganda, you'll still find millionaires, but you'll also find a huge wealth divide.
Even if the capitalists call like the Finnish state Finnish, it still doesn't belong to the average Finnish person.
The only thing I would say is that I believe that there's more than two classes. It's not. I don't think it's just the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. I think there's also the people that are the new money. Who the bourgeoisie can be divided into the landed gentry and the new money. The new money are the people that work their way up, but they're hated by the landed gentry. The entire caste system around wealth, where they want you to marry someone who's also wealthy. Something like, for example, Donald Trump, he would be landed gentry, whereas someone like Elon Musk would be he new money.
Yes, but differences does not mean that they're different classes, because classes are based on property relations. So, like, yes, of course, there could be differences between different capitalists, but they're still capitalists because they own the means of production. Like they have private ownership over them. And a proletarian, whether it is a black or a white or a Latine proletarian, they are still proletarian because they have to sell their labor force in order to live. So yes, I mean, it's not to ignore these like idiosyncrasies between them, but they are still just two classes, because class is based on a property relationship towards the means of production and land.
I guess kind of what Marx is getting at is like, okay, in feudalism, the country would be the property of the monarchs. It would be the property of the lords. Whereas just in capitalism, that property right is changed from being hereditary lords to like the bourgeoisie, the people who have the money to purchase these things and already possess them. The workers don't own the country because they don't own the land or the factories or anything like that.
It's kind of continuing this idea that this is not a struggle between nationalities, but it's a struggle between classes. If you have, let's say, an American capitalist and an American worker, they don't actually have a common interest just because they're American. They're actually antagonistic to each other. The capitalist is exploiting the worker. Similarly, if you have like a Russian worker and a Russian capitalist, they might think, well, oh, isn't it great that we're both Russians, we're both countrymen, but in actuality, they fall into two hostile classes that are antagonistic to each other. All of these capitalist countries, they are controlled by the capitalists. The workers and capitalists don't actually share the power in any way. So in that sense, the workers don't have a country. If the capitalists use nationalistic propaganda, well, it's just propaganda. It doesn't actually mean anything. However, of course, the workers can still love their country. Like patriotism means that you love the people of your country, you love your country, but it would be erroneous and strange to say that if you want to be patriotic, then you have to support your capitalist government. Because that government doesn't actually represent you. It just represents capitalists.
A lot of people struggle to make find the difference between patriotism and nationalism. Like they're in this trance where they believe that it's exactly the same. Like for one to be a nationalist and one to be a patriot.
Yeah, let us mention that this is to be patriotic as well isn't an excuse to be selfish or bigoted towards others, regardless of their about depending on their nationality. That is
right. And Froth was asking about nationalism and anti-imperialism and stuff like that. Let's say that, like American capitalists, if they attack the Philippines or something, yes, of course, the people of any country, they can try to overthrow a foreign oppressor or a foreign colonizer. That's kind of getting into Lenin's theory of imperialism. You can unite to try to overthrow a foreign colonizer, but, that only gets you so far. Once the foreign colonizer is gone, well, now you still have to struggle against your native capitalists. Nationalists, like these bourgeois nationalists, they think that, oh, well, if only we had independence, and if only we got rid of all the foreign oppressors, then everything would be just fine and hunky-dory. Well, no, it actually wouldn't be, because when you get rid of the foreign oppressor, now you just have your own native capitalists. It might be a little better, but it's still a problem.
Do you support like a world socialist republic?
World Socialist Republic. Well, I'm an internationalist, so I support voluntary cooperation between all peoples of different countries. That means that if the different countries agree to cooperate more and even merge, then sure, but we couldn't do that against the will of the people. Otherwise, that would just be subjugating people and colonizing people and conquering them.
I think it's a goal, for us to progress into the next stage of civilization, for us to unite.
If a world socialist republic would happen, would you be okay with it?
Yeah, I would be fine with that.
But if it was up to you, Finnball, would you want a world socialist republic? Do you want it?
Let's say it like this. If the whole world was socialist, yes, that would be fantastic. And should there be some kind of socialist government of the whole world where all the countries decide things together? Yes. But at the same time, I think different countries would still have to be like some kind of administrative units in and of themselves, because you can't just have one administrative unit that's the whole globe. That's way too big. So obviously, yes, you would still have local city councils, you would have municipal councils.
It's like the United States, but socialist, the whole world.
Maybe, I mean, something like that.
Almost like a union of socialist republics or something.
Yeah, maybe World Union of World Socialist Republics. Maybe. I mean, the more united, the better. But I don't know.
If the whole world was socialist, in your opinion, you wouldn't want you would want a world republic.
Well, what do you mean by independence?
Like, they're still separate nations, not connected.
What do you mean not connected? Like, what kind of independence do you want? I mean, Finland would still be called Finland, and Finnish people would still live here.
I know, but I mean, if there was a map of the world, they would be independent. Like, there would be different flags and borders. It wouldn't be all just united.
Yeah, but what does it matter if they draw a border on the map?
The borders are just lines in the sand, really.
No, my point is that if the whole world was socialist, right? Would you want like there to be still like different flags and borders, or would you like the whole world to be united?
I don't think it matters if people have different flags or something, but I mean, I think it would be cool to have different. I mean, even different towns have flags, sure, and yeah, I'm sure there would still be like a border that says this is where Finland begins, but like I don't think that really matters. I mean, if you look at like the border between Czechoslovakia and East Germany, yeah, there was a sign that said this is the border, and there was a border, there was a line on the piece of paper.
That would be like a state boundary at that point. But I mean, it wouldn't even be directly comparable to that. It'd be more like going from one city to another. Like, yeah, there's a border, but do you really care?
What do you think of nation state? Not nation states. What do you think of countries that are like artificial? Like they have multiple ethnicities within one, but they were created because of something else. Like let's take Pakistan, for example, a country that I come from. It's a very diverse country. However, no single ethnicity really dominates it. Only the biggest minority is Punjabis. They make up around 40 to 45% of the population. So, like, what would that be as? Would that be a bunch of nations, like ethnicities, divided up into those, like, or would it be one single nation? If we were to decide a world socialist republic?
Since Marxism-leninism agrees with or advocates the view of self-determination of nations, if all those nationalities, let's say that Pakistan was socialist, if all those nationalities decided that they want to stay together, then they can do that. If they decide that they want to split into their own distinct parts, they have the right. But I think it would be unfortunate if they really felt that they hate each other so much they have to separate. But if that is what is required, then the U.S. is a good example, because the U.S. has like a long history of racial strife where the black people have been and the indigenous people have been oppressed for a very long time. So they might feel like they want independence because they've been repressed and they haven't been recognized, they haven't been given adequate rights. So they might want separation, but in an ideal case, they wouldn't need to do that. In an ideal case, they would say, well, now we get treated equally, so we'll stay.
So Native Americans, would they would have their own homeland, for example?
If they refuse to be with other people, then yes, they would have to be given that right. Otherwise, it's just conquering them.
There's New Africa. I was going to ask, do you know about the Black Belt by any chance?
Yes. At this point, I'm not sure if most black people would actually want like a black territory, but like a black government or a black autonomous region in the U.S. But if that's what they like, in my opinion, they should be given a referendum, and if that's what they want, then they should have it. But the point isn't that we really advocate that people have to separate or have to split. It's just that if they don't even have a choice, then it's just subjugation at that point. And to be united, it has to be based on friendship and equality, and it has to be voluntary. Like, Finland is a country where Finnish people and Swedish people get along pretty well, so I don't think we would have to split up, and it's not even practically possible, but in other countries it's not like that.
But I have met Finnish people that hate all the Swedes and like say, oh, we shouldn't have to learn their language just because they have a small population within Finland.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's a lot of hatred towards them, but the issue of like whether they want the language to be compulsory or not, that's different. Like, there's a lot of people who don't like the language being compulsory. My Swedish sucks, but I kind of regret that I didn't learn it better. What are the immediate policies that the manifesto proposes for advanced countries trying to transition to socialism, and what is their purpose?
Nationalization of banks. The bringing of common ownership of land, I think, is one of them.
Yeah, so the manifesto has like this list of 10 things that it proposes for the most advanced countries. I'm just gonna read through these so you get an idea. So, 1, abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. 2, heavy progressive or graduated income tax. 3, abolition of all rights of inheritance. 4, confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels. 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. 8, equal liability of all to work, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of all distinction between town and country by a more equable distribution of the populace over the country. And 10, free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, a combination of education with industrial production, etc., etc. Some of those have already been done in countries, for example, free public education, progressive income tax, and stuff like that. But obviously, some of these have not been done, like nationalization of all land, abolition of inheritance and stuff. So these were simply first steps towards socialism in 1848. Those were like some of the demands at the time. Sometimes you see like libertarians and right-wingers looking at this and saying like, oh, did you know the United States is actually a communist country because they have a Federal Reserve? And they'll make silly arguments like that.
The failure of that is that like these are guidelines, and the federal bank is a private institution. It's not actually like a government bank. If they were talking about a national bank in the sense that most European countries have, they would have more of a point.
Right. So these 10 things don't actually describe like what a socialist or communist society would look like. They're simply immediate policies that Western countries, most advanced countries in the mid-1800s, that those countries would implement as like first steps towards socialism.
I would like to add something about nationalization mainly, because while I do agree that it's very necessary and important to nationalize all industries, because, privatization fucking sucks. But I think it needs to be said that nationalization should be done in a socialist state, because in a bourgeois state, like in my country, in Mexico, we have a lot of socialized industry like electricity and oil. However, because of the neoliberal dictatorship we had, because of them, there was a fuck ton of mismanagement and just, privatization of previously collective, like state-owned industries. And those who remained state-owned, they're extremely corrupt in every way imaginable. So I think it needs to be said, we can't just nationalize stuff, because if we just nationalize it with a bourgeois government, then it would just be the bourgeois government in control and just fuck us over.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. If a capitalist state nationalizes something, it's still used to serve the interest of the capitalist class. I guess a good example of this would be something like Finnair, for example. It's like the state owns it, or at least the state owns a majority in it, but they still they're not functioning as a utility. They're functioning as a for-profit company. So just because the state owns it, it doesn't really necessarily matter, because in the capitalist system, it still functions as a company that just tries to make profit. And yeah, okay, the state can get money out of it, but it's still used to exploit the workers and rip off the customers.
Yes, state capitalism, basically. Like
State capitalism, exactly. Last question. Why does communism mean the disappearance of political power?
I think I know, because political struggles are mainly created by class, and in communism, with a classless, stateless, moneyless society, there won't be any like ownership divisions, so they like politics itself wouldn't like necessarily be of use.
Yeah, it has to do with the character of the state. So the manifesto says that when in the course of development class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat during its contest with the bourgeoisie is compelled by the force of circumstances to organize itself as a class, if by means of a revolution it makes itself the ruling class, and as such sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of classes generally, and will therefore have abolished its own supremacy as a class. In place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Current society is a class society where the public power, the state, is ruled by the capitalist class, the ruling class. But if there were no class antagonisms, then you wouldn't need the public power to be an instrument of political oppression. It sounds a little weird to say that political power itself will disappear, but it just has to do with the fact that the state will wither away, that the fact that these mechanisms for one class to oppress another class will wither away. The public power is only used to just manage our common affairs. The state would wither away, and society would actually represent everybody, not just a ruling class. So yeah, I guess that's all for today. In 2 weeks, we will probably do both chapter 3 and 4 because they're a lot shorter.